it's a good tie-in to UFC 160 because obviously Bigfoot Silva earned his title shot with those two impressive wins. We talked about Hopper Brown a moment ago, and he beat him. And, of course, he beat Overeem and vaulted himself into position for the rematch taking place this Saturday. So, without further ado, let's get some lines on that. What does it look like right now for the main event of Bigfoot and Velasquez for the second time?
Well, the line right now is pretty ridiculous. It's not the first ridiculous line we've seen on a UFC main event recently, and it's not going to be the last one. But Cain Velasquez is a minus 800 favorite right now, and Antonio Silva is a plus 550 underdog. So really long lines in Velasquez's favor.
I'm not at all surprised because that was actually the first question I asked Velasquez on the conference call last week was, how do you make people watch this fight thinking it won't be exactly the same as the last fight? And I got the reply I expected, which is that every fight is different. He's a different guy. He's looked impressive in his last two wins. And I expected him to say that. But at the same time, I'm still thinking to myself, you are going to double leg him to the ground and massacre him just the way you did the last time.
Exactly, yeah. And, Cain Velasquez, when it comes to interviews and public relations, is Captain Cliche. He's going to say the politically correct thing, but he knows that he's a way better fighter than Antonio Silva. He's way faster. He's a better striker. He's a better wrestler. He's going to get top position. Silva might be a little bit of a better submission artist, but Velasquez is a better grappler overall, and it's going to look the same as the last fight. Maybe even a little bit longer just because, that cut came into play. But even if the cut didn't come into play in that last fight, Velasquez was just annihilating him, and I don't see anything different happening here. He's just got such a speed advantage here that Bigfoot can't keep up.
Yeah, and Bigfoot as much as admitted that in the conference call. He said, I would have to be reborn as somebody else. And I'm assuming that's an accurate translation from Portuguese to English, but the translator said, I would have to be reborn to be as fast as my opponent. So the only thing I can hope for is to use my big heavy hands and hit him.
Yeah, and he's going to get a chance at the start of each round, or as long as Velasquez chooses to engage him on the feet. And if he can't get it done there in one shot, and the only person who's been able to do that is Junior Dos Santos, I just can't see any other way that he gets it done. And really, I can't see any way he gets it done if the fight goes past the first round, because he's going to be so worn down already by that point that it's going to look rough out there for him.
Yeah. And it's kind of a shame, too, because Bigfoot is a very likable guy. I have absolutely nothing against him. I think he's great for the sport. And obviously, his size and his stature and his physique attracts attention, even without him being, I'd say an upper but not top of the heavyweight division fighter, but still somebody that's always dangerous just because he does have those heavy hands. It's just a shame that it doesn't seem like he'll ever get to the top of the mountain when you got guys like Cain and Junior ahead of him.
Exactly. And you look at his losses, they've all been losses. Well, not all of them. 3 of his 4 losses have come because guys have been able to hit him on that giant chin that he's got. And as big as it is, you'd think he'd be able to take a punch a little bit better. But this is the heavyweight division. There's big guys. They hit really hard. And when you've got as big a target as he's got with his chin, it's going to be rough to be able to get to the top of the division and stay there. And, he's skilled in all areas. I don't want to, begrudge him as a fighter. He's just not on the level of Cain Velasquez.
No, and the one guy that might be up near that level is Junior, and he's in the co-main event against Mark Hunt, another guy who's trying to claw his way to the top of the heavyweight division, and with 4 straight wins and some impressive knockouts, he's getting a chance, but it's going to be very interesting to see if he can get past Junior, because I think once again you got a case where somebody that hits really hard is going against somebody that's really skilled in all areas.
Absolutely. Mostly we've seen from Junior that his striking is phenomenal. We saw, there were people that watched his pre-fight warm-up or his media workout before his UFC debut against Fabricio Verdum, and, they were texting each other and doing all sorts of stuff, just saying, have you seen this guy hit mitts? This guy's got amazing hands. So that's been primarily what we've seen out of him. But we have seen a little bit of the rest of his game. If he wants to take people down, he was able to take Shane Carwin down, but he really hasn't needed to mix it up a lot when it comes to his fights because he's been so superior on the feet. So it'll be interesting to see in this fight with Mark Hunt, who really the only danger he poses is on the feet, how JDS goes about it.
What's the odds looking like right now for this fight?
Right now, over at Five Dimes for this fight, you've got JDS as a minus 450 favorite and Mark Hunt as a plus 360 underdog. So again, pretty long odds when it comes to this fight, but really hard to argue with them based on these guys' skill sets and what they've accomplished so far.
Well, if you were going to do a straight bet as opposed to a parlay or combo of some sort, which one of these two do you think is the better buy at the long odds?
I would have to go with Junior Dos Santos. I just really don't see Mark Hunt being able to land that punch that he's been able to land against guys like Stefan Struve. He's dealing with a different level of striker in there right now. Junior Dos Santos, not only is he a skilled striker, he's going to be much faster than Mark Hunt overall. And we've also seen that when he fought Cain Velasquez in his last fight, he's able to take quite a bit of punishment before he actually is going to quit. So he's going to keep coming for the full 15 minutes. I don't see Hunt being able to put him away in this fight. And if that's the case, I just don't see any way for Hunt to win.
So even with the odds being that long, you're still going with the favorite.
I would. Yeah, I'm not going to put my money on an underdog just for the sake of losing some money. I'd rather make a little bit on a big favorite than lose a whole lot on an underdog.
I understand that philosophy, but I've also heard Nicolika say, something quite different in certain fights. He says that sometimes when the odds get so ridiculous, you might as well put $100 on the dog because anything can happen in a fight. And we've seen that happen on a few cards recently, so he's not necessarily incorrect. I always like to think if I had put $100 on Matt Serra to beat George St. Pierre, I'd be a rich man right now.
Exactly. But I think if you're going to go that route, you know how Hunt is going to win this fight. You know that if he wins, it's very, very unlikely that it's going to be anything other than a knockout. And if you take those odds instead of the straight odds, you can get Hunt by TKO or KO at plus 510. If you really, really want to throw money on Mark Hunt, that's where you've got to put the money on him. It's not going to be in the straight line because that win's going to be coming by a knockout.
I agree. So we'll move from there to Glover Teixeira versus James Tahuna. And my sneaking suspicion, before you tell me, is that this is another one where the odds are kind of long in favor of one person. And I would say Teixeira is that person, but maybe it's closer than I'm led to believe.
So before I reveal the odds, what would you peg Teixeira at as a favorite in this fight? If you could throw a number out there.
My guess would be something like minus 350 to minus 400 in his favor.
Okay, so he's actually a little bit of a lower favorite than what you're thinking. He's minus 300 right now. The underdog price on James Tahuna is plus 250, so it's a little bit closer. And I think that's because a lot of people, there's this hype going around about Glover Teixeira being the next guy at light heavyweight, but there's a lot of people who really recognize that Glover Teixeira isn't exactly a young guy. He's 33. And he has shown some holes in his game. He is pretty well rounded. He's got strong striking. He's got pretty good wrestling, and he's got a black belt in jiu-jitsu. But he doesn't have the greatest defense when it comes to striking. He's been rocked by Fabio Maldonado in one of his UFC fights. So we've seen that there are a couple chinks in his armor. And when it comes to James Tahuna, we've got a guy who showed a lot of resilience against Ryan Jimmo. He got kicked square in his face. He went down. He looked like he was out of that fight, and he actually came back to win the second and third rounds, which was one of the big knocks on him was that he didn't have the cardio to last with some of those top flight fighters. So he showed that he's got that resiliency and he's got a little bit of cardio that we haven't seen from him before. So James Tahuna is an interesting fight for him. So I think a lot of people are giving Tahuna some respect here, and that's why the line isn't quite as long as some of the other ones we've seen.
That's all a fair argument, but I look at Tahuna's record, and I feel like there's a lot of guys that he's been very game in there with, and You mentioned the Jimmo fight, and we certainly salute that performance. But I don't see one guy on Tahuna's list of victories, the likes of Rampage Jackson. And while I do admit that Teixeira has some holes in his defense when it comes to striking, we saw that with Rampage. We also saw that he was able to survive that and go the distance with him and pick up the win. And that was probably the best Rampage has looked in any of his recent fights. So my thinking is that Teixeira is probably on another level because he took the best Rampage we've seen and was able to beat him. And I don't think Tahuna is better than Rampage.
Um, I'm not sure that Tahuna is better than Rampage, although I think if they fought, it would be pretty close at this point. But I do think that you're right. The big thing that separates Glover and Tahuna in this fight is the ground game. If Glover decides to take this down, I think four of Tahuna's losses have come by submission, and the only other one was due to an injury. So we've seen in his most recent loss, it was against Alexander Gustafsson. I would definitely peg Glover Teixeira as a better grappler than Gustafsson, and Gustafsson was able to take him down, take his back, and sub him in the first round. So I think if there's a clear path for Glover to win this fight, then going to the ground is going to be that, because obviously Tahuna is at his most dangerous on the feet, or if he gets you down and gets on top of you, he can do some pretty good damage. But if Glover can control that wrestling, that's going to be his biggest key to victory, and that's why he is a big favorite. He does have that one huge advantage.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope you can find a clear path to victory from Gray Maynard and TJ Grant because this one is absolutely a toss-up as far as I'm concerned. I don't know the line, but I look at them both as being great wrestlers and having strong striking ability. We've seen Gray Maynard rock Frankie Edgar. We've seen TJ Grant maul some people. It just seems to me like these two guys should be about dead even.
That would be the thought, but actually, Gray Maynard, who is a lot more well known by the public, is minus 210 right now, and TJ Grant is plus
Wow.
175. So there is a bit of a gap in those odds. And this is actually one of the plays that I'm going to be making on the card. I'm going to be betting on TJ Grant because I just think there comes a fight in every fighter's career where we find out that he's not quite what he used to be. And I think that this is that fight for Gray Maynard. In his last bout against Clay Guida, he didn't look impressive at all. Even though people were pissed off with Guida about, running around and putting on the performance that he did, a lot of people still felt that Guida won the fight. But it sort of seemed like the overwhelming public sentiment was what really won Maynard that fight because it wasn't the performance that he put on inside the cage. So if you look at that, he was striking with an inferior striker in Clay Guida. TJ Grant is much more devastating on the feet. We saw him absolutely wipe the floor with Matt Wyman in his last bout. We've seen him outstrike Evan Dunham, who we just saw again this weekend, is a very capable striker. And I think he can do the same to Gray Maynard in this fight. The one thing that Maynard has is he's the better wrestler, but I think Grant's going to come in here and he's going to be the bigger fighter. And he's also got experience against very good wrestlers. He had a very close fight with Johnny Hendricks when he fought at welterweight. And I think even if Maynard does get it down, TJ Grant is very active off his back. He creates a lot of issues for guys from his guard, and I think he can do that for Maynard. And that's not really something we've seen anyone do against Maynard since Nate Diaz. And a lot of people also thought that Diaz-Maynard fight was very close as well. So TJ Grant, I'm with you. I think this fight is much closer to a toss-up than the lines indicate, and I'm betting on TJ Grant here.
Yeah, if I had to pick one of these two guys, I would go with TJ Grant, but it's not something that I think is an overwhelming buy. It's just that right now he's looked great ever since he dropped down to lightweight. He's got 4 straight wins, and you mentioned the Dunham fight, and you mentioned the Wyman fight, and I was there live for the one in Chicago, and that was brutal. That was one of the best finishes I've seen in a while. So you'd be hard pressed not to pick Grant if you were there in that building that night. It was a spectacular performance, and it has earned him a higher place in UFC. We've seen him in more promos, and Dana White has gotten more behind him and said this kid is the future. So this is his chance to prove it.
Exactly. Everyone talks about the next Canadian being Rory McDonald or Jordan Meehan, but you've got TJ Grant over there on the East Coast, and he's representing Sidney Crosby's hometown of Cole Harbour, Nova Scotia. So he's another Canadian who's doing some pretty big things.
Well, you're certainly making our unavailable co-host Peter H. happy by throwing the shouts out to the Canadian fighters. And since you mentioned Jordan Meehan, really quickly before we move on to the other fight on this main card, what did you think of that performance against Matt Brown? Were you as surprised as I was that it seemed like Matt Brown just got the better of him the entire fight?
I was surprised. I just thought it was something where he would be a little bit more well prepared for the pressure that he knew Matt Brown was going to bring. When you're fighting Matt Brown, he's got one speed. He's going to come at you 100%. And it just seemed like Jordan Meehan wasn't ready to deal with that. I'm not sure if that was because he took the fight on short notice. He didn't get a full camp in or what it was, but I was pretty surprised that he wasn't able to get that victory, because I do think that if they were to fight again and they both had full camps, I think Meehan is the better fighter overall.
Probably so, and he sure looked like he was a stellar fighter when he came into UFC and beat Dan Miller, who, the Miller brothers are both very hard guys to finish in fights, so he set a
Yep.
tone, but as you said yourself, maybe he came back too soon. When you have a full camp and you get ready for a fight and you take that fight, it's like a huge adrenaline dump the moment that fight's over, and to come back in a few weeks' time, that's very hard to do.
Yep. It's a little bit of youthful exuberance on his part, I think. So, a lesson learned for him in the future. Make sure you're fully prepared, because when you're in the UFC now, there's a reason that there are very few guys who get on long winning streaks and very few guys who make it to the top, because everybody in the UFC, well, almost everybody in the UFC is a top-notch fighter, and they're going to give you a different test each time out there. You can't just do your generic preparation and think you're ready for all comers.
Absolutely. And speaking of which, that takes us to the other fight that's on the main card of UFC 160. And you got to think that Donald Cerrone is going to be prepared for the boxing skill of KJ Nunes. He's not going to make the same mistake twice.
Yep, and KJ Nunes isn't going to bring the same problems. I'm assuming you're referencing the Nate Diaz fight. KJ Nunes isn't going to bring the same problems to Donald Cerrone that Nate Diaz did. He's not the big volume striker that Nate Diaz is. And when there's someone who isn't really pushing Cerrone, isn't really coming at him, he's really able to dictate the pace of the fights well. He's very good at mixing his punches and his kicks. He does have a good ground game, far superior to KJ Nunes if he decides to take it there. And I think all of those things justify that right now he as well is a minus 300 favorite, and Nunes is a plus 250 underdog.
Okay, well, that doesn't surprise me at all because I had Cerrone as the favorite going into this as well, so not really a shocker.